Okay, yeah. So I may take some maybe around 30 minutes or so to share my thoughts. Then we'll have some discussions or question answer session based upon the contributions from the participants. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining this session as well. So without much ado, I will proceed to my presentation. The way I have planned the presentation is basically talking about the concept of identity, connecting it to position as well as power, and how identity could be seen in the context of immigration, and how disidentification plays a role in that one. Also, a bit about, at least one slide about the translocational identity, where transnational families is reality, especially in Indian context. And finally, one personal observation, one slide on the colonial cousins or post-colonialism in a way. The way I have planned this presentation, along with academic references, is using the methodology of autoethnography. Well, this is not a full research on autoethnography. I have relied on the concept of autoethnography, where I would be referring to my own observation and experiences as an immigrant for about, say, 8 or 9 years when I talk about disidentification, identity, and immigration. As most of you know, autoethnography is one of the qualitative methods in research, which is an approach where the author, the researcher, draws on their own experiences, written in the forms of personal narratives, which actually contribute to the knowledge production. So the lived experience of individuals or groups add value, evidence, and even more legitimacy to understanding of a phenomenon or explaining the knowledge production, especially in research. So as I said, I will be referring to my experiences, my observations, along with lots of academic references. My presentation has references to several others where I will be adding my own observations and lived experiences into them. One of the fundamental concepts when we look into social work practice or even understanding a person in society, and especially in immigration context, is the concept of identity. We all carry identities. Say, for example, we name our identities while describing ourselves. So to give a very simple example, if you call an office to make an appointment for something, they will ask you identities. What is your name? And name is your identity. The language you speak is identity. On even the color of the skin is an identity. The position that you carry in the public domain is an identity. It could be, say, teacher, student. An age is identity. So there are some identity which is observable, which is naturally demonstrated for every individual. There are some other identities we try to project ourselves. And there is also a sort of strategic use of identities in our everyday life. So, say for example, if you're talking to a police person, police station, you may use an identity which is perhaps very influential, so that you can influence the process of your communication with the police officer. Whereas you are in an office where you want to get something, say for example in a government office or something, the identity that we use or the identity project would be something which is not so influential or which is not very dominant, so that we can get whatever favors or whatever services we look for. So the whole question of identity is very interesting discussion in sociology as well as in social practice. And one more concept to go with the social identity is also the question of the social location. Social location, to give one definition, not actually a definition, but one explanation from an author, is a social location of the individual, which implies one's place in the society, and which is maybe demarcated or defined by factors like gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and language. We all have our own social locations, and many social dimensions, as said in this explanation, could be gender, race, ethnicity, religion, language, family name, wealth of the family, even the physical location of the place. All those factors contribute into social location. And as in Indian context, we could even add caste as a significant social dimension in deciding the social location of the individuals. So social location actually defines who that person is, himself or herself. In another way, social location is also kind of a factor that contribute to a subjective identity, or social location, or our own identity, or we define ourselves based upon our own identity, and that is what we do. So for example, when we go for an interview, what we do, we try to present our credentials, which is also part of our identity. Or when you talk to someone, when you meet someone and try to introduce yourself, what you do is like sharing of the identity. Okay? So even the social dimensions of identity is used by a person to define themselves. And that is a subjective element of the identity. So on the other side, the identity is also their label, which actually helps other people to identify yourself. So it actually works in a way where identities are used for the subjective formation of the individual's identity, as well as it actually helps other people to identify themselves. And all these factors of identity actually helps other people to recognize your social location. It also comes with several aspects of rewards, positions, judgments, which we'll discuss in the subsequent slides. Okay. And these identities puts a label on the person. Okay. And these labels actually put people in some social categorization. Say, for example, to give a plain example, when we say the concept of housewife, what you do, we are a housewife. And where do you come from? You say the name of a remote village. Where do you live? Maybe you say you are living in an apartment or a flat in a metropolitan city. What you do, you are a professor. What you do, I'm a teacher. Looking at the ability of the person, all these identities puts people into some kind of social categorizations. And these social categorization and the image following the social categorization are socially constructed, and they are culturally specific and local specific. To give an example of the social position, the cultural specific context of social positioning, look at the identity of as a teacher in India or in Kerala, where it is a highly respected position. But when you move that from to a different country, say for example, a North American country, the position of teacher, the respect for the position of the teacher commanded in India may not be as equal when you move from one location to other. To give another context of culture, like when we look at the, when you say a student, and rather an example of a housewife, that identity bears a sort of cultural judgment within Indian context, which may not be equal when it comes to a North American context, or within the community itself. When you say you are a housewife living in a rural area in India versus housewife living in a urban area, would have its own different connotations and social construction on the understanding of the identity itself. One of the invariable understanding of analyzing identity is that every identity carry power, and there is a power dynamics operating within the identities. So we saw that every identity actually puts people in social categorization. Identities actually ascribe a position to people, and I should also mention about the position ascribed attributed by caste in Indian context. As I said earlier, the position to an identity is based on the existing social structure. And when we say social structure, it consists of all the interrelations where individuals operate, whether it be family, whether it be society at large, whether it be education, whether it be religion, whether it be government institutions, or very evidence systems like patriarchy. And it is a social construction based upon the social structures. And there exists a hierarchy of powers for these social categorizations. So identity, social categorization, social positions, and one more point to go with it is social status given as a result of the social positioning, which of course is again a result of the identity of the individual. And it follows a hierarchy. And fortunately or unfortunately, it also somehow determines access to resources. Again, going back to some of the examples, when we say, I am a teacher teaching in this particular university and belong to this place, that itself gives you some understanding about how do we see a person, their identity and their privileges and status, versus somebody living in a rural area with limited resources, or with an identity that may not be carrying much of the access resources, or may not be placed in a well-respected position in society. So what happens is that these hierarchical attributes of social identities and positions keep some people in a marginalized position and others in privileged position. Again, going back to examples from India, caste could be one where we can very clearly see the marginalized positions as well as privileged positions. It could be being a man, could be there. In order to maintain such positions of superiority, which actually exist in every society, dominant groups may deploy process of othering anyone deemed to be different, creating a sort of them and us divisions, which label others as inferior and legitimate the exercise of power over them. Another example to explain this concept is sexual minority people. If a person is from LGBTQ community, how they have been treated by the society, where heterosexuality is a kind of norm. I mean, there are several other concepts related to this one, and the one concept is a normative understanding or a normative power structure, where the dominant groups will be legitimately understood as the normalcy, and they hold the power to make those categorization of people who are outside the boundaries of the normative understanding of society as othering, and they invariably fall into a marginalized context. So when we come to immigration, there is a whole lot of disruption happening to the identity that we carry. The whole purpose of talking about explaining about identity was to understand the foundation, to have a foundational understanding of identity, the power structure and the hierarchy, marginalization, oppression, and dominance, and how it operates into immigration. So immigration actually implies a dislocation, relocation at multiple levels: structural, cultural, personal. So the government systems, the powers dynamics in the community, the structure that we used to live is being changed. The cultural context of in the relationship of the people gets changed. The personal relationship understandings even the personal value systems, behavior, everything gets changed or affected in the immigration process. Okay. As we saw earlier from the reference of Dominelli, there is a sense of otherness as well as a sort of rejection on the basis of difference in the context of children, schools, playgroup, in workplaces and everyone. So one of the order that I have repeatedly referred here is Anthias. The migrant is dynamically placed in 3 locales of their intersection. And it's very evident. One is the society of migration. The second is the homeland. And third is where we are in as a migrant group. So where we have come from, where we are here, and to where we belong to, specifically the ethnic identity group. We are involved in a new place. Okay. And there is also concept of space and process, time, space, and process, where the identical formations, disruptions, challenges, and settling happens. I'll come back to the concepts of time and space and process subsequent slides. So, well, immigration disrupts identities of the immigrant people. I have taken a few sentences from Rochera, which further explains my point. So it can bring along the challenge of tasking restructuring identities through a social process, integration, which grows up within the relationship between the self and collectivity and leads to feeding of group belonging and group identification. And this group identification is very specifically relating to the ethnic identity of the immigrant individuals. On other side, looking from the host community, or the community to which immigrants come, they also undergo a disruption. And when I talk from Canada, Canada is a multicultural country. The city that I live has almost 1 million people or 10 lakh people. And there are at least 200 languages spoken here, 200 languages. And Canada, if you ask me, Canada, if you get into a bus in Toronto, that bus itself will have people speaking at least 10 languages, which is very multicultural. Canada actually receives, last year, there was 4 lakh people brought in here as new immigrants. Even when we look at Kerala as well, we can see that, looking at the dynamics of immigrant laborers coming to Kerala from other parts of the country, it's interesting. How do people from Bengal or Tamil Nadu come, and what is the dynamics of their identity when they come? Of course, they are not comparable. They are comparable at certain levels, but they are not comparable in other contexts, because international immigration has its own different context. Okay? So how do we are affected when a few people from other states comes in as a Kerala? It is the same thing for people in North America as well, for people in Canada, how they are affected. So the host society also confront increasing cultural diversity and social environment. So what happens is that this new scenario of immigrants coming to a host society will activate a process of symbolic negotiation, reorganization, and transformation of self, not only for the new immigrants, but also for the host society to an extent, eventually preserving or unsettling the systems of inclusion and exclusion, and resting on societal power, of course, with asymmetries that contour identification process. So it's a long process. It is where how the host society treats the new immigrants, and what are the power dynamics occurring in the integration of the different identities that comes to a new society, and how do a new identification process happens. Unfortunately, given the social structure as well as the social construction of understanding identities throughout the world, there is definite othering process which actually leads to a kind of inclusion, exclusion, in our society, or inclusion exclusion of the new immigrants to a society that we can see in every society, like, be it in India, be it in North America, be it in any part of the world. So the new immigrant has to actually identify themselves through the dominant identities demonstrated by the host society, where some of their identities they come with to the new society would undergo lots of changes, and there is a kind of friction happening, and at the end of it, as Rochra says, there is a kind of contour of identification process where they define and determine their identities. So moving on, the reality of this immigration and redefining of the identity in immigration actually goes through disidentification. So the concept of disidentification was basically initially referring to disidentification on the context of the identity of the queer people, sexual minority people, but it has been used in discussions on the identity formation and disidentification in several sectors. So I borrowed it from that theory of queer, fundamentally from queer theory on disidentification. So looking at the context of disidentification in immigration and identity, I would rather explain it on how minoritarian subjects, where an immigrant is a minority, and those whose identities render them a minority status could be queer, people of color, and how do they negotiate their identity in a majoritarian world? And when we say majoritarian world, it is not the number of majoritarian world, it is also the context of the dominance of the host society or the society to which a new minoritarian subjects are trying to enter. So often what happens is that the majoritarian world does not recognize or in some way punishes or even attempts to create the existence of those who do not fit into the normative subjects. The concept of normative subject is always defined by the dominant community. And when we say dominant community, it also refers to the structural powers, social construction of the power, the value base of the community, as well as the culture of the community. So some of the examples, especially when we come to North American migration, where you can find this othering process and disidentification could be in language. So you may be speaking, say, 4 languages, which actually is a powerful identity for an immigrant individually. But when it comes to a different world with a majoritarian identity of speaking a single language in their own pronunciation, that the power of speak or the ability to speak 4 languages does not help you, or even that actually has been put in a kind of minority position, because you have to identify yourself with the majoritarian world that you live in. Educational credentials could be one challenge. Social status is another one. There is a whole lot of shift in the social status of the individuals when they come to a different world. So this actually leads to a sort of disidentification. And moving on, or further explain on the disidentification, actually, it's a performance that minority subjects engage in to survive within, in a way, inhospitable or a bit unwelcome spaces, while working to subvert them, working to overcome them in some way. And this struggle for survival happens every time for an immigrant. Okay? And this struggle may not be accurately comparable with the struggle of a person from North India moving to Kerala for work. The struggle is much, much different for a new immigrant moving to North America. It need not be just North America, but be part of any other developed world. I'm specifically focusing upon North America or other Canada because I refer to my lived experiences when I talk about these concepts. Okay. So disidentification presupposes a recognition of class identity, location, and several other social identification criterion. So when they recognize it, recognition is also refusing it. So when somebody sees my color, that itself is a recognition, but that is used as a strategy for othering or another way marginalizing. Okay. So it actually stresses the importance of marking one's position by denying that which either has been attributed to you or likely or feared as a attributable to you. The dominant society actually do not want to attribute some of the positions they hold for themselves, which, as we referred earlier, would push or force a new migrant to go through a sort of unsettling process within the host society to define the boundaries of their own identity. So the new migrants actually goes through this process of disidentification for themselves in search of what is their identity and how that has been recognized, and even when recognized, how it has been rejected by the host society. So one of the key elements of before that one of the key elements of this identity process is relation to, or one of the key social dimensions of identity immigrant people carry is the ethnic identity. Very interestingly, ethnic identity is used as a social indicator or social identity by the dominant groups to recognize the people as well as to exclude them, to reject them. So what happens is immigrants actually use ethnic identification as a prime example of social identity that tends to be particularly salient to people who migrate to another country. Immigrant people hold on to their ethnic identity. Well, ethnic identity is less valued in the new culture, the new society. So, but ethnic identity operates to hold positionality among and within the collectives for the immigrants. So very specifically, if I'm to give an example of a nurse from Kerala who had been working somewhere else in another part of the world, maybe in a Gulf country, holding a very big position, and when they come to Canada, their educational credentials may not be accepted or as at par with the educational credentials in Canada or another country, which actually rejects the occupational identity they had in their previous experience or previous life before moving to Canada, which actually affects their social position where they had placed themselves in relation to others. And when they come to Canada, in the larger society of the host society, the position they hold for themselves is being disrupted. Their identity as a whatever they had defined for themselves is disrupted. Now they have to go through the whole process of a kind of friction process. I don't know how to what is the right word for it. Kind of frictional process, a process which is very not very easy for them to define themselves again, to get into the positions. And when they fail for it, when they can't reach that one, what they hold for, what they rely on is the ethnic identity. So it's very interesting to see the dynamics in the ethnic community groups in immigrant communities. I was personally looking at some of the stories from US and Canada and see how the ethnic identity is being reclaimed through lots of association, community groups, religious gatherings, because the identity they hold for themselves in a larger society in the previous in their previous life cannot be regained here because of the othering process that happens in a dominant community. So ethnic identity operates to hold positionality among and within the collectives of the ethnic identity or ethnic groups among the immigrants. So translocation identity is also a reality, given we live in a situation of transnational families, and perhaps people from Kerala as well as India can also easily understand the context of transnational families, because there are several families where one sibling is living in Australia, another sibling is living in Gulf, and another sibling is living in North America, and parents are living in India. So that actually gives a very clear picture of transnational families, which actually helps us to understand the context of the translocational identities. So when you look at the identity of a person, the translocational identity treats lives as being located across multiple, but also fractured in interrelated social spaces at different times as well as at different times. I mean, different types as well as different times. So it's very interesting to see this translocation identity, because a person might be in a position of dominance, highly respected, as well as in subordination simultaneously on the one hand, or at different times or spaces on the other. Okay. And this is also related to one of the other concepts that I talked earlier, how a social positioning is culturally defined or locally specific. To give an example, is a man may be subordinated in class terms, but his position advantageous in relation to his female partner. And this is very interesting when you look at the immigrant context, because in many of the immigrant families, perhaps women may be more earning than men, which actually puts women in a higher position, but the patriarchal system actually puts men in an advantageous position than in comparison to their female partner. A person's position could also be in a change, or higher or lower, depending upon the position, time as well. So to give one example, is a migrant returning to their homeland may achieve a high class benefits as they display relative wealth to poorer villagers. And there are lots of people from Africa as immigrants in Canada, and their identity could be very specific when they go back to their countries, or people from India also, when they go back to them, they have a very specific different identity. Or when I look at myself as a faculty in a social program here in Canada, this position itself may have a different identity when this has been transferred or this has been seen from other parts of the world. Okay. Whereas it may not be positioned at that level when I live in Canada. Okay. And perhaps I come to my last point on the colonial interesting discussions. It's a reality that we live in a post-colonial world. And when I say post-colonialism and colonialism, I specifically refer to the imperial colonization by the Europe on different parts of the world, including India. And when I come to Canada, I live with the people who had been colonized by Europe for long, as well as people who had been colonizers or settlers, like the Canada and America, as we know, was discovered. When the use of the word discovered was been challenged by the First Nation people or the indigenous people in North America. So it was in 1492, Christopher Columbus came here as the first settler. Then it is all settlers from Europe who had been here, and they have colonized. When we say colonized, they have destroyed the culture of the indigenous people here. They have destroyed the language. They brought their religion. They brought their language. They brought their culture. So we have people in Canada who are indigenous here, which constitute about like 5% of the whole Canadian population. We have people from several parts of the world living in Canada. Now, one of the difference that I see is the difference in the education and bringing up of people from non-Euro-American centric and other forms. When I say other, say India could be one example, or education in Africa could be another example, or the indigenous education of people in Canada could be one example, which is not very typically Euro-American centric. And very interestingly, as an immigrant from India, I can make perhaps an unexplained but understandable connection with indigenous people here in Canada, as well as people from Africa. And it's a very interesting interplay of the identities of individuals from different identities and different parts of the world. Or rather, it is a bit more difficult to identify with the Euro-American people in Canada than identifying yourself with the indigenous people and people from Africa, or even also people from other parts of Asia. And one of the key significant factor contributing to that would be the colonization and Euro-American centric education and approaches. Or rather, personally, I have been, or most of you people who is listening to me may not have been educated in a very typical Euro-American centric approaches, or the education that we follow. To give one example is like, these are my observations. I usually say, we have a whole lot of common sense than people. Perhaps, the statement I make could be controversial or debatable, but this is from my experience and my observation. We have lots of more common sense than perhaps people, kind of educated in a different stream of perhaps in a very Euro-American centric approaches. And it need not be just education, but to also be factors like population and the competition people undergo in their life. Okay. And the cognitive framework are also perhaps built on a kind of a colonial perspective, and it is very, very evident for an American or a person of a dominant community or a settler in North America may not have much understanding about other cultures. I usually say, like for a graduate student in Kerala, if you ask them to speak 10 sentences about Canada, they can speak. But for a graduate in North America, if you ask them the capital of India, or at least few basic understanding of any other country, they may not have, because the educational framework they follow would be much, much different, or rather focused upon their own individual identities than relating to the identities on other parts of the world. So these are my observations based on experiences. That is why I call this kind of a sort of autoethnographic, along with references to scholars on the field. I think I have finished my presentation. We have these are some of the important references I have used, and thank you very much for listening to the presentation. Now I will leave it to the moderator and the participants for sharing your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you, Baiju sir. Thank you. We had a very informative session. He mainly focused on formation of identities in a context of mainly discussed about identities. Then it's some of the observable factors. Then power dynamism, identity migration. So the session is now it is open for discussion. You can ask questions, or otherwise we can text the questions in the chat box. Okay.
There is a question in the chat box actually. Babu sir, if you can read it out to Baiju, maybe that would be helpful, I think. The question from
I can see it. The question is, we are interested to know about your disidentification experiences after your talk.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. and one of the internal conflict that I have when I talk in this conference is also my own identity in relation to SSUS as well as in my current identity. Leaving that apart, the certification is very interesting. Okay, so perhaps maybe one of the I'll take one example. The social positioning of an individual in a society is very interesting. So, to put it very plainly and bluntly, so being a professor in a university, the identity for myself and the social position and the social status that puts me in a very different identity when I live in India, or perhaps even to look at the economic context of it, social context of it, I would say being a professor in India would be among perhaps the 1% of the Indians. I don't know if that is right, but that is what I'm just kind of presuming. Whereas when it comes to Canada, as a new migrant, all those identities are kind of fractured, disrupted, and you fall into a category of the vast majority of this country, or even much below them. So whatever identities that you bear with you are not recognized. They are, people identify it, but they actually reject it. And you feel the otherness of it. And those can happen. One is language, and does not mean language is, it is not just English. There are several Englishes, it is not just one English, there are several Englishes. And people look for, that normativeness of one's language in comparison to the dominant language spoken here. So it is Western Canadian accent of the English here, which I don't think I can ever attain that level of fluency or pronunciation. There, the color of the skin, you are othered, very definitely being a group. To put it very simply, I mean, a different context, like when I go to a meeting in the schools where my children study, you see how you have been treated. It does not mean that you are, actively discriminated, but there is an element of the otherness which is observable, which has been felt upon us where we go there. Yeah. Even education, like one example I referred to was like the acceptance of the educational credential, okay, or the position that people had been bearing in their previous life. Like for me, as a position of a university faculty, which is not being identified, which is not being recognized when we come here. So it all actually contributes to a sort of internal oppression, a feeling of marginalization, and subsequent a struggle for survival as an individual. Yeah, so this is what I think I would share. I think I answered to an extent for the question. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
So I would like to ask a question. So I want to ask about this, the identity of migrant social worker. So, like social worker. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Okay. Or social work educator. So, as you were saying, there is different ways in which the migrants are othered in a context of Canada, based upon your class, color, your ethnicity, and who you are, even your professional status lacks recognition. In such a context where there is a active process of othering that is happening, and social work as a profession requires the gaining of the trust of the client, and also respect of the client for us to go on with whatever the intervention plans that we are having with the client. So if you are dealing with a client from a majoritarian identity background, even when that client might be seeking the help of the social worker, like how does this building up? So I think there must be additional tactics and techniques that migrant social worker might be using, like in such a context, to build this rapport, that we of like that is supposed to be the main stay of the social workers. So how does that happen? What strategizing, what sort of negotiations happen? Because I have heard many migrant social workers describe their experience of, even going to, when we are child welfare workers and you are uh, going to a, like you know check up on the white maybe parents, and how they disparage your efforts and so on. So
Thank you very much, Reshma, for that interesting question. And I agree with you. There is an active process of othering happening with the professionals in healthcare settings, and be it social workers or in other professionals. Maybe to answer that, I maybe start from the structural perspective of it, or the institutional perspective of it. The othering actually starts from the lack of recognition for the credentials. Not only in social work, or much worse in some other professions. Say, for example, doctors. There are doctors, well qualified specialist doctors who had been practicing in their own countries for several years and come to Canada, but they end up as taxi drivers, or they end up in working with jobs which requires just high school education here in Canada, and that's a reality. So that is one example of the othering process, and it so happens for social work as well. People, because there is a challenge of the process of getting equivalency and credential approved to be a registered social worker in different provinces, and it varies between the provinces. So there is an institutional challenge that happens. And when it comes to practice, yeah, it is true, there is an othering process happening, especially by the dominant groups for the people. But the way, I mean, we are successful. Maybe there are three ways that I will see it. One is the universal application of social work principles and values, or rather humanity. I still remember one of my first classes, because when I came here, I started teaching within 1 year, and I was in my first class, shivering, not knowing what to do. I mean, I was teaching with another professor, and I'm teaching in a class to all white students. That was in a rural area, and that teacher was very supportive. And we were talking about family social work, and think that I have never been to a white family. I'm teaching to family social work students of white schools, and we were talking about communication. And my colleague teacher was speaking about communication of families. Then I jumped in at some point. I said, "Let us talk about smile." And smile is one of a key factor in families. Then everybody looked like to me, and I was talking about how smile is a universal language. And my colleagues, Elaine would still say, "Oh, remember about you talking about smile," because what I'm referring to is that there are some universal values of social work or rather of human beings, which is applied at any parts of the world. And we social workers are very good at that, applying those universal things. Second is the authority of social work. So we are a social work in a facility, and that social work identity itself carries lots of authority, power for you, legitimately by the virtue of the position, apart from all the vulnerabilities social workers may have from their international qualification, color of skin, language. And that authority could be very significantly positively used in working with other people and overcoming the challenges. And third, I would say, is again, one of the statement that I made earlier was on the common sense. I mean, that may not be the accurate way to describe it, but we see things in a different way. To give an example, I know several social workers who are from India, as well as from other, who have been educated here. So to give an example is, there is a patient in the hospital and the patient does not have any documents, like they don't have a birth certificate, no bank account, nothing. So if there is a person who has been educated here, they come to the person and say, okay, so you do not have an ID card. So how do you get ID card? And there is one office where you can go to get that ID card. The white social worker will go and try for ID card, and there's the office says no. Then that is then for the white social worker. I mean, when I say white social worker, I put people who are educated here in different context. But if it is an Indian social worker from international experience or somebody who has been educated in India, they will definitely get the ID card. So they go this way. If this office does not work, they'll go to other office and they will find a different way for it. So, and that is something which I cannot actually explain. That is what I used one sentence in my slide. It is unexplainable, but understandable. How to use it. And it also comes from the cognitive formation and the struggle we may have had within the competitive world to get this done. So that is also been applied. So that is why people have been, kind of successful, even though there is a very strong aggressive gathering process happening, and which of course, so it's a kind of challenge, kind of. I usually say, when as a allied faculty in the department, when I do things, if I do things for 10 mark, I get only 8. Whereas if it's a white faculty, if they do things for even if they do things which is worth 8, they'll be getting 12 because of the privileges they have. And it's a kind of continuing struggle for everyone in the profession when they get into any sort of profession. I think I answered it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Baiju. Like when you were speaking, I was thinking, I was just reminded of this term politics of anticipation. Usually it is used by urban geographers to narrate the strategies that people living in very precarious conditions in the city, like for example, slum dwellers use. So they have to anticipate, as you said, the difficulty in getting documents, difficulty in getting their voices heard, difficulty in getting into several of the welfare schemes. So, but how carefully and how successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully also, but the kind of strategizations that goes into it, the kind of maneuvers, the daily struggles that people living in precarious position take upon themselves to make themselves heard and get what they wanted. So that is what is meant by politics of anticipation. Maybe the migrants are also like one example how they use this politics of anticipation. Thank you for that. Alexa. So if there might be other questions, so I won't be taking much of your time.
Yeah.
There is one question in the chat by how did you overcome this othering process? I think I referred to a bit of it when I answered to a question from Reshma. Perhaps it may not be correct to say overcome it. It has not been overcome. It's an incessant struggle for a person, and does not end anywhere. So this is a continuous struggle. So whatever we do in the daily struggle for survival is what we do. And one more point to add could be, one of other observations I have made about the work that we do would be like, we are emotionally attached to work than many other people or people from other parts. So that emotional attachment to work actually is a virtue in some context for performance, as well as a kind of a burden because of the stresses that actually brings along with it. There is one more question. Migrants negotiate their identities on a daily basis, which is extremely interesting. Nonetheless, there are dominant social groups involved in the migration channels, networks pattern. This has the effect of reproducing the same social structure in diasporic communities. It has also been observed that the Indian diaspora is averse to acknowledging categories such as caste. They, on the other hand, want affirmative action for themselves. So how do you look at these negotiations for recognition as well as resistance? I'm not sure if I got the question clearly. I got one part of it. Can the person perhaps further explain it in some way? I'm sorry for asking it, but it's on a daily basis.
I think Anish must be here.
Anish, is it possible to ask one again? That it's like Anish.
I can respond to some of the observations based on what I understood from some parts of the question. Indian diaspora is averse to acknowledging categories such as caste, and maybe I'll start from there. Indian diaspora is yeah, I don't think that is true. Well, apparently or overtly, there may be an rejection of caste, but in practice does not happen. And all those systems of caste also exist, even the Indian diaspora in North America. And very interestingly, there had been cases of honor killing happen right here in Canada in an immigrant family from India. Honor killing means like one girl got married to somebody of a different lower caste, and they arranged for killing, and that happened, and that family was deported from Canada. So, and there was one of a social work scholar who is basically from India, and she was doing a research on that, domestic violence and abuse. So all those disparities of identities and social class caste systems operates even in diaspora, even in the it may not be as apparent as explicit as it happens in the Indian life, but they are intrinsically operating here. As well as class systems, the class or all those demarcations of social identity are also operating in implicit ways in the social life of the diaspora here. But on the other side, the immigrants are also exposed to a very different, progressive, liberal, value-based culture in North America or any other countries they migrate into. And there is a process of settling themselves to this particular different culture. To make it very specific, especially the new generation or the children who are educated here and who grew up here are much more inclined to absorb the value basis, which is more equitable, liberal, progressive, critical, radical, and they imbibe it and they bring into the families. So invariably, every immigrant family undergoes through the process of some sort of assimilation to the different cultural values, which I would argue is more affirmative in nature, more egalitarian in nature, and it comes back to it has been reflected in the diaspora. It actually also comes back to the discussions in social media, or it comes back to discussion in the home country as well. This is what I would, how do I respond from what I understood. I'm sorry. It was not very clear to me, but I would appreciate if there is further explanation of the question. Thanks for the question.
Baiju, yeah, like when I was reading that question, I was also reminded, like, Anish actually is mentioning that there is a reproduction of the, social structures that is existing here in the, like here or wherever their home country. So the caste as a part of social structure, maybe as you said, in a like in a different way, but still that is being like affirmed in the daily life experience of the migrants. So structural inequalities in India is being reproduced in the destination point of migration at a different scale maybe, but still it is being reproduced. And but I think Anish also wanted to add, like, so like for an upper caste migrant or a dominant migrant from a dominant caste from India, when they wanted to affirm the same social structures in the in the country of their destination, because that gives them some sense of identity that is similar to which they experienced in their home country. For a Dalit migrant, for a female migrant from that country, uh, they might also be looking into ways in which this dominant social structures and dominant identity markers from their origin, from the place of origin. So, for example, like how during the Durban conference was going on, the Dalit university professors, Dalit students from migrating to other parts of the Europe or America, they banded together, forcing India government to revoke its earlier position. There was no race-based discrimination in India, saying that we have to include caste as a caste very similar to the racial discrimination that is happening. So India should take part in the Durban conference. That force came upon India government by the migrant Dalit group, which was also dominant at that time. They network with the international organization. So there is also, like, different ways in which like people from different migrant locations actually negotiate and resist. So maybe I like I am just talking for Anish. I don't know whether this is exactly what he meant, but anyway, like while reading this question, like I was also reminded, like, similar questions that came up to me. So the negotiations that people from different migrant community, that gradations within the migrants from the same ethnicity. Maybe all of us might be from the same ethnicity, but other other identity markers like caste or gender, it forms different, it asks for different kind of negotiations actually, which means, like, which again comes to this, that thinking that identity is not one and stable for all people, like even from the similar social group. And you are also talking about the strategic use of identity. And I remember this Gayatri Chakravarti's speech talking about the strategic use of gender, when the whole women's movement was falling apart by the voices from the people of women of color, women, black women, Dalit women, or the lesbian women, all of them banding together, saying how feminist perspective prioritized white women feminist position, and that which which actually silenced the voices of women from other social identity markers. And Gayatri Chakravarti was saying, though that is true, at least sometimes we might have to use this women as a common identity marker strategically to gain some political entry. And the whole debate that happened after that, I won't go into it. So maybe that's what Anish also meant. I'm not very sure.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that addition and further discussions on that. Yeah. The point I was not very clear was that, the second last sentence, they on the other hand want affirmative action for themselves. Yeah, I mean, that reproduction of all those oppressive systems also happens in the Indian diaspora. It's very interesting to see how it happens and how it unfolds and how they cannot actually get out of it. But as it goes on, I mean, the generations on generations, I don't know, as it happens in every part of the world, those things may be undergoing some sort of changes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful talk. Now, I would like to request Ms. Safa to deliver the vote of thanks.
No, Kirti, I think you will have to ask Babu sir, who's the moderator of the session, to end the session first before you deliver the vote of thanks.
So,
We welcome Babu sir to give the concluding remarks, and only then we will go to the vote of thanks.
sir, Babu sir.
Okay, thank you. We had a very dynamic session, especially I think the question by Anish may be further lead to 2 or 3 session on a different aspect of I think because different dimensions of migration, then identity, caste identity, discussing that in Indian context and Western context, all kind of things want to be discussed. It is actually a lengthy question, and it may take more analysis and more discussion, I think. Actually, in this session, we got an idea about the issues related with the disidentification, especially in the context of post-colonial era, especially like the challenges or the what we call it, the experience, especially shared by Jissa, given an idea about how this people from different areas face different kind of issues related with negotiating their identity in a majority world. So I think it is a serious issue. Negotiating identity in a majority world. So that is actually one of the important remark which I noted from this session. I think so. It was very informative, and at the same time, we had an active participation from participants. They had a different questions with regard to the point which discussed or shared by user. So hope that the session was informative, and I hope that things are actually shared. So thank you all for your active participation in the session. Thank you, Baiju sir. Thank you, Reshma madam, and our analysis department. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to welcome Ms. Safa to the vote of thanks.
Good evening. We've reached the end of the first day of International Webinar Aloft on Dislocations and Fragmented Identities. I'm here to extend a warm gratitude to all gathered here. We've been listening to the talk given by Dr. P.V. Baiju on the theme Dislocations, Migration and Post-Colonialism, Autoethnographic Reflections on Survival. First, I would like to thank the speaker of the day, Dr. P.V. Baiju, Assistant Professor, Macquarie University. Thank you for speaking out your experiences and insights regarding social identity. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Babu MT for moderating the session. I would also like to thank all the faculty members and students who have assembled here. Once again, let me offer my profound gratitude to each one of all. Have a pleasant evening.
Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Thank you, Baiju. So what's the time now? Is it like 10 o'clock in the morning or like 8:30 in the morning?
No, 8 o'clock in the morning. 8 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. Actually, I have a class today, Tuesday, but fortunately it occurred. So I don't have a kind of online session today. So that was helpful. Otherwise, I may not have been able to do it today. Okay, Tuesday morning is one.
Okay. So all the very best with your autoethnographic experiments. And
Thank you.
so like, definitely would try
Me too.
and read it once you write it out. So that would be a very interesting one, actually.
Yeah. And we are working on with the two other faculties who are also from not actually internationally qualified, but colored faculties. We may come out with one autoethnographic experience of academic work in our own fields. We are going for a presentation in March, but we also have discussed about making it a scholarly work. I mean, we haven't started it, but that is in the discussion process.
Yeah, so maybe we can expect something like in the line of Homo academicus from Bourdieu, where the academic itself
Yeah.
is taken to task. Okay.
Okay, then. Thank you. Bye. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Before we conclude the session, please everyone fill the feedback form before leaving the meeting. Now we can wind up the session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.